Listen to this amazing story of miraculous healing. Enjoy listening. The fluorescent hum of the office lights was the only constant companion Emily truly trusted. At 61, every line on her face, every precise movement of her hand across the blueprints spread on her vast drafting table spoke of a life meticulously constructed. Her world was a symphony of straight lines, right angles, and perfectly calibrated spaces. The Nexus Tower, her magnum opus, was nearing completion, a 15-year ambition about to solidify into a sustainable, community-focused skyscraper that would redefine the city's skyline. Emily, a highly successful architect, believed in tangible legacies, in structures that defied time and weather. Her day began at 5 a.m., a silent ritual of strong black coffee, a perfectly balanced protein shake, and a brisk walk through the still sleeping city streets, mapping her thoughts for the day. By 6:30 a.m., she was at her office in the heart of downtown, the first to arrive, the last to leave. This relentless pursuit of perfection, while yielding unparalleled professional success, had carved deep canyons in her personal landscape. Her relationship with her daughter, Clara, was a strained tapestry of polite obligations, punctuated by Clara's well-meaning but often misdirected attempts to soften Emily's formidable edges. As for her grandson, Leo, he was little more than a name, a distant artistic whisper Emily had long since dismissed as unstructured and therefore irrelevant to her ordered universe. Today, however, a subtle discord resonated within her perfectly calibrated routine. A persistent, dull ache had taken root in her lower abdomen over the past few weeks, a quiet hum beneath the usual symphony of her focused concentration. It was nothing severe, merely an intermittent nuisance, easily dismissed as the price of long hours and the inevitable stress of nearing a gargantuan project's completion. She'd tried her usual remedies, a longer walk, an extra glass of water, an over-the-counter pain reliever that barely touched the thrumming discomfort. Her typical boundless energy, usually a wellspring she drew upon endlessly, felt strangely muted, a faint echo of its former vibrancy. Even her appetite, usually robust and predictable, had waned, leaving meals untouched, a surprising phenomenon for a woman who prided herself on her disciplined sustenance. "Emily, you look a little pale," Clara had observed during their perfunctory Sunday call. "Are you getting enough rest?" Emily had bristled. "Of course, Clara. I'm simply focused. The Nexus Tower demands my full attention." She didn't mention the quiet rebellion her body was staging, the persistent fatigue that even her strict schedule couldn't overcome, or the curious loss of taste for her favorite roasted vegetables. She dismissed the notion as a weakness, a distraction from the monumental task at hand. Her body, like her buildings, was meant to be a fortress, impenetrable. Any cracks were merely superficial, easily plastered over with will and determination. But the fissures deepened. The dull ache became a more insistent throb, often accompanied by a vague unease she couldn't quite pinpoint. One morning, the coffee, usually her invigorating elixir, tasted like ash. Another, her favorite silk blouse, felt oddly loose, a silent testament to a weight loss she hadn't even noticed amidst her architectural calculations. Emily, a woman who prided herself on absolute control, was beginning to feel a creeping sense of something beyond her command. Reluctantly, she booked an appointment with her GP, Dr. Aris, a kindly man who had seen her through decades of annual checkups and the occasional bout of flu. Emily, perched stiffly on the examination table, gave a terse account of her minor discomforts, downplaying their persistence. Dr. Aris, however, looked at her with a knowing gaze that bypassed her professional facade. He noted her subtle pallor, the faint circles under her eyes, the slightly distant quality in her usually sharp demeanor. "Emily, these symptoms, while seemingly minor individually, are raising a few flags," Dr. Aris said, his voice gentle but firm. "The abdominal pain, the fatigue, the unexplained weight loss. I'd like you to get some more comprehensive tests, a blood panel, and perhaps a colonoscopy, just to rule out anything serious. We're seeing more and more of these issues in people your age." Emily's jaw tightened. "A colonoscopy? Dr. Aris, I'm in the final stages of the Nexus Tower. I simply don't have time for invasive procedures. The thought of something invading her perfectly ordered internal landscape was deeply unsettling. Emily, Dr. Aris insisted, his eyes unwavering, your health is paramount. If we don't address these minor discomforts now, they could become major disruptions. Please consider this. It's better to be safe than sorry. Reluctantly, Emily agreed to the preliminary blood test, still convinced it was nothing more than stress. She returned to her office, the blueprints of the Nexus Tower waiting, a reassuring symbol of order in a world that, for the first time in a very long time, felt subtly, unsettlingly out of alignment. The faint throb in her abdomen was a persistent reminder, a tiny crack in the foundation of her meticulously constructed life. While yielding unparalleled professional success had carved deep fissures in her personal life. Her relationship with her daughter Clara was a series of polite, strained conversations about logistics rather than genuine connection. And her grandson, Leo, a fleeting, almost non-existent presence, an artist whose chaotic life baffled Emily's ordered mind. It started subtly, insidious as a hairline crack in a perfectly laid foundation. A dull ache low in her abdomen, a persistent throb that Emily attributed to long hours hunched over CAD drawings, or perhaps the unusually rich meal Clara had insisted they share at that new fusion restaurant. She'd always had an iron constitution, her body an efficient machine that obeyed her will. A few ibuprofen, a strict adherence to her high-fiber, low-fat diet, and it should disappear. It didn't. Then came the fatigue. Not the pleasant exhaustion after a vigorous workout or a mentally stimulating day, but a deep, bone-weary lassitude that even her customary 3 shots of espresso couldn't penetrate. She found herself dozing off in her ergonomic chair, her mind, usually a steel trap, feeling like a sieve. Her meticulous schedules began to fray at the edges. She missed a 5 a.m. walk, then another. The thought filled her with a disproportionate sense of failure. And the food. Emily, a creature of precise appetites, found herself pushing away her perfectly portioned meals. The thought of her daily protein shake, once a fuel source, now churned her stomach. She lost a few pounds, then a few more. Stress, she muttered to her reflection, her lips a thin, dismissive line. Just stress from the Nexus Tower. She bought a new multivitamin, convinced it was a minor deficiency, a temporary blip in her otherwise perfect health. But the blip persisted. The abdominal ache became a more insistent, gnawing presence. The fatigue deepened into an oppressive shroud. One morning, the mirror reflected not just a tired face, but a faint, yellowish tinge to her skin she tried to ignore. It was no longer a minor annoyance, but a growing, unsettling anomaly in her controlled universe. When the dizzy spells started, brief but alarming blackouts that made her grip the edge of her desk for support, Emily finally conceded. Not to illness, but to the need for data. She scheduled an appointment with her longtime GP, Dr. Aris, a man she considered a necessary cog in her maintenance routine, like a mechanic for her meticulously kept vintage car. Dr. Aris, a kindly man with perpetually tired eyes, listened patiently as Emily, ever the architect, presented her symptoms as a series of disconnected facts, devoid of emotional inflection. Fatigue, intermittent abdominal discomfort, some weight loss, recent mild dizziness. My assumption is stress-related anemia, perhaps a vitamin deficiency. I'd like a full blood panel. Dr. Aris, however, knew Emily. He saw the subtle tremor in her hands, the unnatural pallor beneath her carefully applied makeup. Emily, he said gently, we'll do the blood work, of course, but given the persistent abdominal pain and weight loss, I'd also like to schedule you for a colonoscopy, just to rule out anything serious. Emily bristled. Unnecessary, highly invasive. I have design reviews all next week. Emily, Dr. Aris's voice hardened slightly. This isn't about your schedule. It's about your health. These symptoms combined warrant a closer look. Please. Reluctantly, Emily agreed. The colonoscopy was an indignity, a violation of her private, controlled body. The preparatory cleanse felt like a cruel joke, stripping away her internal order. She endured it with stoicism, convinced it would reveal nothing more than a minor inflammation, easily rectified. The call came 2 days later, not from Dr. Aris, but from a specialist, a Dr. Anya Sharma, an oncologist. The very word sent a primal shiver down Emily's spine, a discordant note in her perfectly composed life. "Ms. Thorne, this is Dr. Sharma. I'm calling regarding your recent colonoscopy and biopsy results." Her voice was calm, professional, yet carried an undertone of gravity that made Emily's blood run cold. "Could you come into my office this afternoon? We need to discuss them in person." Emily's world, meticulously built on steel and glass, felt suddenly flimsy, like a house of cards in a hurricane. She walked into Dr. Sharma's office that afternoon, Clara by her side, a silent, disapproving shadow. Clara, ever practical, had insisted on coming, sensing a shift in her mother's impenetrable facade. Dr. Sharma, a woman with intelligent, empathetic eyes, sat across from them, her expression grave. She spoke in measured tones, using words that felt alien, brutal, adenocarcinoma, malignant, stage 3. She used diagrams pointing to a dark, menacing mass on an anatomical drawing. Emily heard the words, but they seemed to float above her head, detached, unreal. "The tumor is quite advanced, Miss Thorne," Dr. Sharma continued, her voice softening slightly. "It's located in your ascending colon, and the biopsy confirms its spread to a few regional lymph nodes. This is why you've been experiencing the pain, the fatigue, the weight loss, and the anemia." Emily felt a cold numbness spread through her. Her body, her unyielding, dependable machine, had betrayed her. Stage 3. Cancer. It was a demolition ball, not a hairline crack. Clara, however, sprang into action. "What's the plan, doctor? Surgery? Chemotherapy? What do we do?" Her voice was tight with barely suppressed panic, a stark contrast to Emily's stunned silence. Dr. Sharma turned to Clara. "The standard protocol for stage 3 colon cancer, given the tumor's size and nodal involvement, is immediate surgical resection of the tumor, followed by adjuvant chemotherapy to eliminate any remaining microscopic cells and prevent recurrence." She then looked directly at Emily, her gaze steady. "We need to move quickly, Ms. Thorne. Time is of the essence." Emily stared at the doctor, then at Clara, whose face was a mask of fear and urgency. Surgery, chemotherapy. Her mind, usually so sharp, felt like a tangled knot. This was not a minor adjustment. This was a complete structural failure, a forced deconstruction of everything she was. Her Nexus Tower, her legacy, her carefully constructed future. It all hung precariously on the precipice of a terrifying, unknown abyss. The thought of her body being cut open, ravaged by chemicals, filled her with a profound, visceral dread. Her pragmatic mind, the one that had always sought control, now recoiled from the ultimate loss of it. She couldn't. Not now. Not when the Nexus Tower was so close to completion. Her life, her very identity, felt inextricably bound to that towering structure. To surrender to this would be to surrender everything. A quiet, stubborn resistance began to harden within her, a silent refusal to crumble. That even her strict schedule couldn't overcome. She'd always prided herself on needing minimal sleep, often quipping that sleep was for the uninspired. Now, 8 hours barely touched the sides of the profound weariness that settled in her bones. Even the morning's brisk walk felt like a monumental effort, and the appetite loss, that was truly perplexing. Food, once a necessary fuel, began to seem unappealing, almost repulsive. She'd dismiss it as a side effect of overwork, her body simply protesting the immense pressure of the Nexus Tower's final phase. "Just stress," she'd murmur to herself, popping another antacid. Her GP, Dr. Aris, a mild-mannered man whom Emily considered adequately competent but prone to unnecessary fuss, had initially agreed with her assessment. "Stress, Emily. You work too hard. Try to relax." But after a second visit, where Emily reluctantly admitted to a 5-pound weight loss she couldn't explain, and the persistent discomfort, Dr. Aris's brow furrowed. "Emily, this isn't typical stress. We need to rule out anything serious. I want to schedule some comprehensive tests, blood work, stool sample, and a colonoscopy." Emily had bristled. A colonoscopy? The very word felt invasive, an affront to her perfectly maintained body. But the insistent ache, the fatigue that was now blurring the sharp edges of her focus, finally convinced her to comply, albeit with an exasperated sigh. The waiting room at the diagnostic center was a cacophony of hushed coughs and rustling magazines, a stark contrast to the sterile, silent efficiency of her own office. Emily felt a prickle of irritation. This was time she couldn't afford to lose. The colonoscopy itself was a blur of discomfort and impersonal instructions. She remembered little, only the vague sense of violation and the burning desire to be back at her drafting table, where she was in control. The call came 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday, at precisely 3:17 p.m. Emily was reviewing a complex structural calculation for the Nexus Tower's central core, absorbed in the elegance of numbers. Her direct line, usually reserved for her most senior project managers, rang. It was Dr. Aris's office. "Ms. Caldwell, Dr. Aris would like you to come in as soon as possible, and perhaps bring a family member." The last part, delivered with a hesitant pause, was a cold knife of dread. Emily's carefully constructed composure wavered. Family member? She had no one to bring. Clara was busy with her law firm. Emily wouldn't dream of bothering her with what was likely a benign, if inconvenient, diagnosis. "That won't be necessary, Dr. Aris," Emily stated, her voice clipped, regaining her professional mask. "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Clara, however, had already received a similar, more urgent-sounding call from Dr. Aris's nurse. She was waiting, a tight knot of worry in her usually composed features, when Emily arrived at the clinic. "Mom, what is this about?" Mrs. Henderson sounded serious. Emily waved a dismissive hand. "Overreaction, dear. Likely some minor inflammation. You needn't have come." But even as she spoke, a tremor ran through her, a premonition of something truly catastrophic. Dr. Aris was not alone. A tall, impeccably dressed woman with kind, intelligent eyes sat beside him, her name tag identifying her as Dr. Anya Sharma, oncologist. The air in the small consultation room was thick with unspoken gravity. Emily's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Dr. Sharma spoke first, her voice calm, professional, yet imbued with a quiet compassion that unnerved Emily more than any shouting ever could. "Ms. Caldwell, we have the results from your biopsy. The findings are significant." She paused, her gaze steady, direct. "You have adenocarcinoma, stage 3 colon cancer." The words hung in the air, shattering Emily's meticulously ordered world into a million glittering shards. Cancer. Not a dull ache, not stress, but cancer. Stage 3. The elegant numbers and precise lines of the Nexus Tower, moments ago so real, dissolved into a meaningless void. Emily felt a strange numbness descend, a protective shroud against the raw terror that threatened to consume her. She heard Dr. Sharma explain, with detached medical precision, what stage 3 meant. The tumor had penetrated through the muscular layers of the colon wall and spread to nearby lymph nodes. She heard words like aggressive, surgery, chemotherapy, prognosis. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling the very foundation of her existence. Clara beside her gasped, a strangled sound of disbelief. Her face went ashen, her hand instinctively reaching for Emily's. But Emily flinched away, unable to tolerate the contact. This couldn't be happening. Not to her, not to Emily Caldwell, the woman who controlled every variable, who built monuments that stood eternal. Her body, her infallible machine, had betrayed her. "The recommended course of action," Dr. Sharma continued, oblivious to the internal earthquake raging within Emily, "is immediate surgical resection of the tumor, followed by adjuvant chemotherapy to eradicate any remaining cancerous cells. Given the stage, we need to act quickly." Clara, recovering slightly, choked out, "Surgery? When? What are the chances, doctor?" Her voice was thin, reedy, utterly unlike her usual assertive tone. Dr. Sharma responded with practiced calm, outlining survival rates, potential complications, the arduous road ahead. Emily heard none of it. Her mind was racing, not about survival, but about the Nexus Tower. Surgical resection? chemotherapy. The very thought of being incapacitated, of relinquishing control of her magnum opus, was more terrifying than the diagnosis itself. The Nexus Tower was her legacy, her monument to a life perfectly lived. And now this insidious, invisible enemy threatened to tear it all down. Not just her body, but her very identity. A cold, hard resolve began to form within Emily, a desperate clinging to the only thing she felt she still possessed: control. They wanted to cut her open, poison her body, leave her a shell. No, she would not let them. Not yet. Not when the Nexus Tower needed her. Not when her legacy hung in the balance. The fear was profound, a chilling abyss she refused to acknowledge, burying it beneath a facade of stoicism that even Clara, usually so perceptive, failed to penetrate. Clara, meanwhile, was already asking questions about appointments, second opinions, the best surgeons. She was pragmatic, solution-oriented, already pushing for the aggressive treatment Dr. Sharma recommended. Emily simply sat, numb and silent, her gaze fixed on a distant point beyond the consultation room's walls. A world where the Nexus Tower still soared, pristine and untouched by the chaotic fragility of human flesh. A world she was determined to reclaim, on her own terms. The thought of surgery, of being a passive recipient of medical intervention, felt like a concession she was not yet ready to make. It felt like surrender. Dr. Aris's brow furrowed. He ordered a comprehensive battery of tests: blood work, stool samples, and finally a colonoscopy. The results, delivered by oncologist Dr. Anya Sharma, had landed like a demolition ball, shattering the meticulously constructed edifice of Emily's life. Stage the third, colon cancer. The words echoed in the sterile consultation room, a death knell to her carefully curated existence. Clara, pragmatic and immediate, had pushed for aggressive treatment, surgery, chemotherapy. Emily, still reeling, had retreated, the shock absorbing all rational thought. The follow-up appointment with Dr. Sharma was a performance of controlled defiance. Clara sat beside her, a taut wire of anxiety, clutching a folder brimming with printed articles on cutting-edge oncology and recovery statistics. Dr. Sharma, a woman whose calm demeanor belied the gravity of her words, laid out the grim options with clinical precision. The tumor, she explained, gesturing to an MRI scan on the monitor, is localized but significant. We recommend a colectomy followed by adjuvant chemotherapy. This offers the best prognosis for a full remission. Emily stared at the luminous image of her insides, a dark, irregular mass marring the elegant symmetry she prized. Surgery. The word conjured images of invasive procedures, long recovery times, a body irrevocably altered. A body that would betray her, leaving her weak, reliant, unable to command her projects with the precise authority she was known for. The Nexus Tower loomed in her mind's eye, its final critical phases demanding her unwavering presence. How could she possibly oversee the installation of the sky gardens, the integration of the solar panels, the delicate calibration of the smart systems, from a hospital bed? No, she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through her clenched hands hidden beneath the table. Clara gasped. Dr. Sharma's placid expression didn't waver, but a flicker of surprise crossed her eyes. Emily, this isn't a negotiation, Clara interjected, her voice sharp with desperation. This is your life. Emily turned a cold gaze on her daughter. My life is inextricably linked to the Nexus Tower, Clara. If I am incapacitated, if I cannot ensure its completion, then what is the point? It is my legacy. She turned back to Dr. Sharma. Is there a less invasive option? A targeted therapy? Something that won't compromise my functionality? Dr. Sharma sighed, a quiet exhalation that spoke volumes of experience with patients in denial. There are experimental regimens, Emily, immunotherapy trials, specific targeted chemotherapies. They can slow progression, in some cases even cause temporary regression. But for stage the third adenocarcinoma, with a tumor of this size, they are rarely curative alone. And they carry their own side effects, often debilitating. Debilitating, but not incapacitating? Emily pressed, a desperate logic clinging to her words. Not the kind of disfigurement or protracted recovery that surgery entails? Dr. Sharma hesitated. The side effects vary. Nausea, fatigue, neuropathy, hair loss. They can be severe. But yes, technically, you would retain some level of mobility depending on your individual response. Then that's what I'll do, Emily declared, her jaw set. An experimental chemotherapy. I'll manage it. I always manage. Clara erupted. Manage it? Mother, this isn't a failing contractor. This is cancer. You can't manage your way out of this with a spreadsheet and a stern look. Her voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. Please, just listen to the doctor. Do what they say. I am listening, Emily said, her voice glacial, and I am making an informed decision. My project cannot wait. My legacy depends on me, and I will not allow this inconvenience to derail it. The chasm between mother and daughter widened with each stubborn word. Clara left the office in a storm of frustrated tears, leaving Emily to arrange for the experimental chemotherapy regimen. It was a rigorous schedule. Infusions 3 times a week, a cocktail of drugs designed to inhibit cell growth. The initial weeks were a brutal test of Emily's iron will. The fatigue she'd experienced before was a faint whisper compared to the crushing exhaustion that now enveloped her. Her body, once a finely tuned machine, became a battlefield. Nausea was a constant companion, turning even the thought of food into a revulsion. Her meticulously styled hair began to thin, clogging the shower drain, a physical manifestation of her body's rebellion. The dull ache in her abdomen intensified, evolving into sharp, cramping pains that would double her over, leaving her gasping for breath. She tried to maintain her routine, clinging to the familiar structure like a life raft in a turbulent sea. She'd wake at 5 a.m., force down a protein shake, and attempt to review blueprints from her home office. But her concentration wavered, her mind clouded by a constant haze of discomfort and drug-induced fogginess. Her precise lines on the CAD software became shaky, her decisions less certain. She'd call into meetings, her voice thin and reedy, trying to project an authority she no longer felt. But the pretense was crumbling. Her colleagues, accustomed to her unyielding presence, began to notice her frail appearance, the dark circles under her eyes, the tremor in her hands. Their concerned glances felt like pity, a humiliation she couldn't bear. Clara, despite her despair, tried to bridge the growing rift. She'd bring Emily nourishing broths, gentle herbal teas, leaving them on the counter with worried notes. Just eat a little, mother, please. Emily would ignore them or force a few sips, then retreat to her room, the nausea overwhelming her. Clara's worried phone calls went unanswered or were met with curt, dismissive replies. I'm fine, Clara, just working. Leave me be. Emily knew she was pushing her daughter away, but she couldn't stop. Clara's concern felt like an accusation, a constant reminder of her body's failure, her own losing battle for control. The Nexus Tower, once her beacon, now felt like a distant, unreachable star, mocking her dwindling energy. Her carefully constructed world, built on order and precision, was slowly, irrevocably coming undone. The experimental chemotherapy, a cocktail of drugs Emily had researched meticulously and chosen for its supposed minimal impact on cognitive function, was proving to be anything but a gentle ally. Each infusion, administered by nurses who treated her with a mixture of professional formality and pity she found unbearable, left her increasingly depleted. The initial fatigue from the cancer now morphed into an all-consuming exhaustion, a leaden cloak that stifled every movement, every thought. Her body, once a finely tuned instrument, felt like a rusted machine, groaning with every effort. The nausea was relentless, a churning abyss in her stomach that made the thought of food repulsive. Even the scent of her usually beloved Earl Grey tea could trigger a wave of retching. The few bites she forced down were often expelled hours later, leaving her weaker, profoundly disheartened. Despite her initial insistence on managing the side effects with stoicism, the reality was a brutal assault on her carefully maintained control. Her weight, already a concern, plummeted further, her clothes hanging loosely on her increasingly gaunt frame. Her once sharp features seemed to recede, shadowed by a pale, almost translucent quality to her skin. But it was the abdominal pain that truly became her tormentor. The dull ache, dismissed in the early days as mere discomfort, had escalated into a searing, persistent agony. It was a vicious, tightening grip that intensified after any attempt to eat, coiling around her midsection like a malevolent serpent. Dr. Sharma, during their increasingly frequent checkups, had noted the distension, the tenderness. "Emily, we're seeing signs of partial bowel obstruction," she'd explained with a grave tone Emily now associated instinctively with bad news. "The tumor is growing, despite the chemotherapy. It's pressing on the colon." Anemia, too, became a constant companion. The world often swam before her eyes, a dizzying haze that made standing for more than a few minutes an impossibility. Her breath would catch in her throat, a shallow, desperate gasp even after the slightest exertion. The once vibrant world outside her window now seemed muted, as if observed through a grimy pane of glass. The Nexus Tower, her magnum opus, the very reason she had clung so stubbornly to this experimental path, became an increasingly distant, abstract concept. Her meticulously organized desk, once a hive of activity, now lay largely undisturbed. The blueprints, the structural models, the endless emails, they blurred into an indistinguishable mass. She tried, in fleeting moments of respite from the pain and nausea, to engage with her team via video calls, but her voice was weak, her focus fragmented. Her colleagues, ever polite, would listen patiently, their faces etched with concern, their questions increasingly perfunctory. The project, she knew, was stalling without her direct, unwavering oversight. It was a bitter irony. Her refusal of life-saving surgery to protect her legacy was, in fact, dismantling it. Clara, her daughter, became a source of both intense irritation and desperate longing. Clara's visits, once filled with increasingly fervent pleas for Emily to reconsider surgery. "Mom, please, it's not too late. Dr. Sharma says," had devolved into a series of quiet, almost mournful appearances. Clara would bring bland, easily digestible meals that Emily rarely touched, adjust the pillows, and simply sit, her presence a silent, aching testimony to Emily's worsening state. "You look terrible, Mom," Clara had whispered one afternoon, her voice thick with unshed tears, as she watched Emily struggle to sip a glass of water. "Thank you for that astute medical diagnosis, Clara," Emily had retorted, her voice raspy, a flicker of her old sharpness briefly surfacing. But the effort of the sarcasm left her breathless, and she closed her eyes, turning her face to the wall. Clara had sighed, a sound of profound helplessness, and left. Emily felt a pang of something akin to regret, but it was quickly swallowed by the encompassing blackness of her physical misery and the gnawing despair that she had made a terrible, irreversible mistake. She had pushed everyone away. Her professional colleagues, once trusted collaborators, now seemed alien, their healthy energy a stark contrast to her decay. Her friends, a small, carefully curated circle, had dwindled to sympathetic phone calls she rarely answered. Even Clara, her only child, was now kept at arm's length, her concern feeling less like comfort and more like an accusation. Lying in the sterile quiet of her meticulously ordered bedroom, Emily would sometimes stare at the ceiling, the unyielding lines of the plaster a cruel mockery of the chaotic, rebellious forces within her own body. The cancer was a siege, and she, the architect of control, was losing. The experimental chemotherapy, her chosen path of defiance, had failed her, and in its failure, it had left her stranded on an island of pain and isolation, her carefully constructed world eroding around her, the foundation of her very being crumbling day by agonizing day. The phantom ache of the Nexus Tower, unfinished and forsaken, was almost as painful as the gnawing in her gut. She was a ruin, and there was no blueprint for rebuilding this kind of collapse. The fluorescent lights of the oncology ward blurred through Emily's tear-filled eyes. Not tears of sorrow, but of sheer, unadulterated physical agony. The partial bowel obstruction, a grim pronouncement delivered by Dr. Sharma just days ago, had tightened its grip, twisting her intestines into a knot of searing pain. The experimental chemotherapy, her chosen path to preserve her architectural legacy, had not merely failed, it had accelerated her decline. Now every breath was a shallow gasp, every movement a fresh stab of fire. The weight loss, once a gradual descent, had become precipitous, leaving her bones stark beneath loose, papery skin. A constant metallic taste coated her tongue, a grim reminder of the anemia that sapped the last vestiges of her strength. She lay curled on the hospital bed, the crisp white sheets doing little to alleviate the chill that permeated her bones. The Nexus Tower, once the vibrant blueprint of her future, now felt like a distant, mocking echo. Its sleek, precise lines, once a source of immense pride, now highlighted the chaotic, untidy ruin of her own body. She had fought against the forced idleness, desperate to maintain some semblance of control, but her hands, once so steady, trembled uncontrollably, and her mind, once so sharp, drifted in a fog of pain and fatigue. The construction site, the daily reports, the calls from her frustrated project managers, they had all faded into a muffled, irrelevant hum. The world outside her pain-racked body had shrunk to the four walls of this sterile room. Clara, her face etched with a desperate, familiar worry, hovered at the foot of the bed. Her voice, usually so firm, was a reedy whisper. "Mom, please, Dr. Sharma. She's saying we need to reconsider the surgery. This isn't working. You're fading." Emily barely registered the words. Her mind was a battlefield, her body a prison. The stubborn defiance that had fueled her initial refusal of surgery had been corroded by relentless suffering. Now there was only a hollow, terrifying emptiness. She had pushed Clara away, her daughter's frantic pleas feeling like accusations, her concern a heavy burden. Her professional colleagues, once a source of intellectual camaraderie, she had simply stopped answering. The thought of them seeing her like this, a withered shadow of her former self, was unbearable. She had isolated herself, retreating into a cocoon of pain and pride, unwilling to admit the extent of her failure. Clara, however, was not so easily deterred. After another agonizing night, watching Emily writhe in silent torment, a desperate, unconventional idea sparked in her mind. It was a long shot, a wild gamble. But what else was left? She picked up her phone, her fingers hovering over a contact she hadn't dialed in years. Leo. The call was awkward, strained. Clara hadn't spoken to her son, Emily's grandson, in months, not since their last argument about his unconventional life choices. Leo, a struggling street artist, was everything Emily wasn't. Spontaneous, messy, driven by passion rather than logic. Emily had always dismissed him with a wave of her hand, a dismissive, unstructured, that stung Leo more than she ever knew. But Clara, in her desperation, saw a sliver of hope in his wild, unbridled spirit. Maybe, just maybe, he could break through the formidable wall Emily had erected around herself. Leo arrived 2 days later, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the sterile hospital environment. He wore paint-splattered jeans and a faded band t-shirt, a stark contrast to the crisp white coats and tailored uniforms. Emily, her eyes half closed, barely acknowledged his presence. She remembered him as a lanky, rebellious teenager, all sharp angles and defiant glares. Now at 25, he was taller, broader, with a nascent beard and eyes that held an unexpected depth. "Grandma Emily?" His voice was soft, hesitant, nothing like the boisterous shouts she remembered from his childhood visits. Emily offered a weak grunt in response. The pain was a constant, dull roar behind her eyelids. He pulled up a chair, not too close, and sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the rhythmic beep of a monitor. Then slowly, he reached into his worn canvas bag. He didn't pull out medical pamphlets or offer platitudes of hope. Instead, he produced a small sketch pad and a charcoal pencil. Emily, despite herself, watched him. His fingers, long and nimble, moved with a practiced grace. He started with broad, confident strokes, then refined them with delicate precision. He wasn't drawing her or the hospital room. He was drawing a building, her building, the Nexus Tower. She squinted, her irritation momentarily eclipsing the pain. "What are you doing?" Her voice was raspy, barely audible. Leo looked up, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Just reimagining, Grandma." He continued to draw, adding details she hadn't envisioned. He sketched vines climbing the sleek glass facade, not as a decorative element, but as if they were organic extensions of the structure, weaving in and out of the precise angles. He added flowing, almost liquid lines to the rigid steel frame, making it appear less like a rigid monument and more like something alive, breathing. He even depicted the surrounding parkland spilling onto the lower levels of the tower, blurring the boundary between engineered and natural. Emily watched, a strange, unfamiliar sensation stirring within her. It was a flicker of curiosity, a tiny spark in the vast, dark expanse of her despair. He wasn't criticizing her design. He was evolving it. He was seeing something she, in her meticulous pursuit of perfection, had overlooked. A hidden beauty in the organic, the flowing, the imperfect. He finished the sketch, tearing it carefully from the pad. He held it out to her, his eyes warm, devoid of judgment. "It's still strong, Grandma, still visionary, but maybe it could also breathe." Emily took the sketch, her trembling fingers brushing his. The paper was rough, the charcoal smudged, but the image pulsated with an unexpected vitality. It was her tower, undeniably, but seen through a lens she'd never considered. A lens that embraced fluidity and natural imperfection rather than rigid control. The sheer audacity of it, the unexpected perspective, was a jolt. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emily's mind shifted, even if only for a moment, from the relentless throb of her body to the quiet, compelling beauty of a line, a curve, a reimagined blueprint. The walls of her self-imposed isolation, reinforced by pain and despair, had just experienced their first tremor. A strange, almost forgotten feeling surfaced. Curiosity. It was a fragile, unconventional blueprint for connection, offered not with medical advice, but with charcoal and paper. Clara, watching from the doorway, saw the almost imperceptible softening in her mother's eyes, and a sliver of desperate hope took root. The soft rasp of charcoal on paper was a sound Emily hadn't heard in decades. Not since art classes in high school, where her precise, almost architectural drawings had earned her good grades but little joy. Now, here in her dimly lit living room, the late afternoon sun a mere sliver through the drawn blinds, Leo sat across from her, patiently guiding her trembling hand. "Just feel the line, Grandma," he murmured, his voice a surprising balm. "Don't think about what it's supposed to be. Just let your hand move." It felt absurd. Her body screamed in protest, a symphony of aches and nausea. The partial bowel obstruction had lessened its immediate, acute grip, but a dull, insistent ache remained, a constant reminder of the war raging within. The anemia made her feel perpetually cold, wrapped in blankets even on a mild spring day. Yet Leo had returned, not with more questions about her health, not with Clara's worried pronouncements, but with a worn sketchbook and a handful of charcoal sticks. He'd started with simple exercises, lines, circles, ovals. Emily, the architect whose life revolved around the straight edge and the perfect angle, found herself drawing wobbly, imperfect forms. Her first circle looked more like a potato. A wave of frustration, so familiar, threatened to overwhelm her. "It's awful, Leo," she rasped, her voice thin. "I can't even draw a proper circle." Leo chuckled, a gentle, melodic sound. "Good. Art isn't about proper, Grandma. It's about expression. Your potato has character." He picked up his own charcoal and quickly sketched a series of dynamic, overlapping circles, some broken, some barely visible. Yet together they formed a cohesive, energetic composition. "See? Imperfection is part of the beauty." He then showed her how to shade, how to press harder for darker tones, lighter for soft edges. He encouraged her to draw the objects around her, the chipped ceramic mug on the coffee table, the twisted branch of the houseplant Clara had brought, her own gnarled hands. Emily found it excruciating at first. Her fingers, stiff and tremulous, struggled to obey. The physical effort exhausted her, but slowly something shifted. As she focused on the interplay of light and shadow on the mug, on the texture of the plant's leaves, the relentless internal monologue that had plagued her for months began to quiet. The pain, while still present, receded to the background, a distant hum rather than a piercing shriek. One afternoon, Leo suggested she draw her view from the window. "Don't try to make it perfect, Grandma. Just capture what you see." Emily looked out at the familiar manicured garden, the perfectly trimmed hedges, the symmetrical rose bushes. She'd designed it herself years ago. Now, through her charcoal, she saw something else. The way the light caught the individual leaves, making them shimmer. The irregular pattern of shadows cast by the afternoon sun. The slight droop of a rose petal, unnoticed before. She drew, painstakingly, for over an hour. When she finished, she looked at the sketch. It wasn't a masterpiece. The lines were tentative, the proportions a little off. But it was her garden, seen through new eyes. A strange warmth spread through her chest, a feeling she hadn't recognized in years. Not pride in perfection, but something akin to wonder. Leo leaned over, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You captured the light, Grandma. See how this line here bends? That's not just a hedge. That's light dancing on leaves." His genuine enthusiasm was disarming. Emily had expected criticism, or at least a polite nod. Instead, she found acceptance. Unconditional acceptance, not for a finished product, but for the process, for the attempt. As the days turned into weeks, Leo became a regular fixture. He never pushed her about her health, never mentioned doctors or treatments. He just brought art supplies, charcoal, then pencils, then even a small set of watercolors. He talked about art history, about artists who broke rules, about finding beauty in the unconventional. He showed her how to loosen her grip, both on the pencil and on her rigid expectations. One evening, after a particularly draining drawing session, where she'd surprised herself by creating a surprisingly vivid sketch of Leo's intense gaze, Emily leaned back against the pillows. "Why, Leo?" she asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. "Why are you doing this?" He paused, cleaning his charcoal-stained fingers with a rag. "When Mom told me you were sick, and that you were refusing surgery, I remembered how you always said the Nexus Tower was about legacy, about leaving something behind. But if you're gone, what kind of legacy is that?" He met her gaze, his dark eyes surprisingly earnest. "I knew you wouldn't listen to doctors, or even Mom, but I thought, maybe if you could find a different way to create, a way that wasn't so rigid, so controlling, maybe that would open something up." He gestured to her latest sketch. "You've always been about structure, Grandma. Order, precision, and those are powerful things. But sometimes life needs a little chaos, a little mess, like this charcoal dust." He smiled, then added, "You said the Nexus Tower was about connection, right? Community? Well, maybe the first connection you need to make is with yourself. And sometimes art is the only language that can do that." Emily looked at her hands, still smudged with charcoal. She thought about the Nexus Tower, a monument to her control, and she thought about the wobbly lines and imperfect circles she now drew. For the first time, she didn't feel like a failure. She felt curious, and something else, something she hadn't felt in a very long time. A whisper of hope that had nothing to do with medical prognoses or architectural deadlines. It was a hope rooted in the simple act of creation and the unexpected connection with a grandson whose unconventional spirit was slowly, gently, chipping away at the walls she had so meticulously built around herself. The internal structure, once so unyielding, was beginning to yield. The world narrowed to a pinprick of agony. The dull ache, a constant companion since Leo's last visit, had exploded into a supernova of pain. It wasn't the searing, twisting torment of the full obstruction from weeks ago, but a relentless, crushing pressure that radiated from her gut, seizing her breath, stealing her consciousness. She felt herself slipping, the edges of her vision blurring into a gray haze. Clara's frantic voice, a distant echo, pierced through the fog. "Mom, Emily, what's wrong? I'm calling Dr. Sharma." The next few hours were a dizzying blur of flashing lights, the shrill wail of a siren, and the jarring motion of the ambulance. She was vaguely aware of being lifted, of hushed, urgent voices, and the cool touch of an oxygen mask. The hospital, a familiar, sterile landscape, reappeared. Dr. Sharma's grave face materialized above her. "Emily, it's a near-complete obstruction again. Dr. Sharma's voice was tight with concern, her words clipped, precise. Your body is giving out. We have to operate, now. There's no other choice. A wave of nausea, not just from the pain, but from the sheer inevitability of it all, washed over Emily. Surgery. The word felt like a death knell, a concession to failure, the very thing she had so stubbornly resisted. Her legacy project, the Nexus Tower, flickered in her mind, a phantom limb that had once defined her. But something had shifted. The fear, the defiance, the clinging to control. They weren't gone entirely, but they were muted, distant echoes against a surprising backdrop of surrender. Risky, isn't it? Emily's voice was a reedy whisper, barely audible over the rhythmic beep of monitors. Given everything, Dr. Sharma's gaze was unflinching. Extremely. Your body is severely weakened, Emily. The anemia, the malnutrition, the previous failed chemo. The risks are significant, but not operating means, well, it means we lose you, and soon. Clara stood by the bed, her face pale, her knuckles white where she gripped the bed rail. Tears streamed silently down her cheeks. Emily reached out a trembling hand, finding Clara's. It was a gesture of comfort, not for herself, but for her daughter. In that moment, amidst the pain and the stark reality of her imminent demise, a profound calm settled over Emily. It wasn't resignation, but a deep, quiet acceptance. The past weeks, the painful unraveling of her carefully constructed world, Leo's gentle persistence, the surprising solace of charcoal on paper. It had all culminated in this. She had fought so hard to control her narrative, but life, in its brutal honesty, had shown her the futility of it. Okay, Emily whispered, her voice gaining a surprising strength. Okay, Dr. Sharma, do it. A faint tremor of surprise registered on Dr. Sharma's face, quickly masked by professional efficiency. Good. We'll start preparations immediately. As the nurses bustled around her, inserting IVs, checking vitals, Emily's eyes fell on the worn sketchbook Leo had left her. It lay on the bedside table, a silent witness to her journey. With a monumental effort, she reached for it, her fingers fumbling with the charcoal stick. The pain was still a fierce beast, but it no longer consumed her. Now it was a backdrop, a dull thrum beneath a newfound clarity. Her hand, though frail, began to move, not with the precise architectural strokes of old, but with a fluid, almost instinctive grace. She began to sketch. Not the sharp, defined lines of the Nexus Tower as it existed in blueprints, but a new vision. The base was still strong, rooted, but from it, organic forms began to unfurl, spiraling upwards like vines reaching for the light. Columns bent and swayed, mimicking the gentle curve of a human spine. Windows were not mere openings, but eyes, some wide and clear, others shadowed, reflecting the complexities of life. She drew the sweeping curves Leo had introduced, the unexpected angles, the interplay of light and shadow that gave life to form. She drew a figure, blurred and indistinct, but unequivocally human, standing at the base, looking up, not in awe of its grandiosity, but with a sense of belonging, of being cradled by its embrace. The tower was no longer just steel and glass. It was an organism, breathing, adapting, accepting imperfection. It was her new perspective, etched onto the page. Clara, still tear-streaked, watched her mother, a flicker of bewilderment in her eyes. "Mom, what are you doing?" Emily didn't look up, her gaze fixed on the evolving lines. "Giving myself a new blueprint, Clara, for what comes next." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. If anything comes next. The drawing was intricate, a fusion of her architectural precision and Leo's organic flow. It was a building that breathed, a structure that allowed for vulnerability, a testament to growth and acceptance. It was a monument to the possibility of beauty found in the cracks, in the unexpected turns of a life that had shattered and was now, perhaps, ready to be rebuilt. Not as she had planned, but as it was meant to be. The anesthesiologist's voice was gentle, a countdown to oblivion. "Just a little pinch, Emily. You'll be asleep very soon." Emily felt the cold rush of the sedative, her eyelids heavy. Her last conscious thought was of the drawing lying on the table, a tangible symbol of her transformation. She had no idea if she would wake up, but for the first time in a long time, the thought didn't fill her with terror. It filled her with an unexpected, profound peace. The surgery she had once refused, the one that threatened to dismantle her carefully curated life, was now the very portal through which she surrendered, not to death, but to the unknown, to the possibility of a different kind of healing. Your body is shutting down. We can't wait any longer. We have to operate, now. Emily heard the words, yet they seemed to float above her, detached from the searing agony that consumed her. This was it then. The surgery she had so fiercely resisted, the very thing she believed would strip her of her purpose, was now unavoidable. A strange, almost serene acceptance settled over her. The fight had simply left her. There was no more energy for defiance, no more strength for control, only surrender. Clara, her face a mask of terror and exhaustion, gripped Emily's hand. "Mom, please. Just let them. Please." Emily managed a weak squeeze. "It's okay, Clara," she whispered, her voice raspy. "It's time." In the sterile, fluorescent glare of the emergency room, surrounded by bustling nurses and the hushed urgency of medical professionals, Emily found herself drifting. Not into unconsciousness, but into a vivid internal landscape. Leo's voice echoed in her mind. "Feel the line. Don't think about what it's supposed to be." And then, an image. The Nexus Tower, not as the rigid steel and glass monument she had designed, but as a living, breathing entity. Its sharp angles softened, its concrete walls unfurling into organic curves. Tendrils of green reaching skyward, intertwining with the light. Inside, instead of sterile offices, she saw vast open spaces filled with light, laughter, and the gentle murmur of creative work. She saw children, their faces alight with curiosity, sketching on easels. She saw herself, not hunched over blueprints, but guiding a small hand, a smudge of charcoal on her cheek. A nurse was gently removing her wedding ring. "We need to get you ready, Mrs. Hayes." "My sketchbook," Emily croaked, her eyes fluttering open. "Is it here?" Clara, tears streaming down her face, nodded, fumbling in Emily's bag. She pressed the worn, spiral-bound book into Emily's hand. Emily's fingers, surprisingly steady despite the overwhelming pain, opened it to a blank page. With a faint pencil she'd salvaged from her bag, she began to draw. Not of the stark reality of her imminent surgery, but of the vision that had unfolded in her mind. Lines flowed, curves embraced, light and shadow danced. It was a fusion of the Nexus Tower's structural integrity and the wild, untamed beauty Leo had introduced her to, a testament to a life reinvented, a spirit finally at peace with imperfection. This wasn't a blueprint, it was a prayer, a final, desperate act of creation before the unknown. Her eyes closed, the pencil slipping from her grasp as the anesthesiologist's voice faded into the white noise of the surgical theater. The next few days were a blur of pain, IV drips, and the rhythmic beeping of machines. When Emily finally surfaced from the haze of anesthesia, the first thing she registered was not the gnawing pain, but the absence of the crushing pressure she had lived with for months. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible relief, but it was there. Dr. Sharma, looking tired but relieved, stood by her bedside. "Emily," she said, her voice softer than usual, "you're a fighter. It was touch and go for a while, but we cleared the obstruction. The tumor, we removed a significant portion, enough to alleviate the immediate crisis. It was extensive, Emily, more than we initially thought." Her gaze was steady, compassionate. "You have a long road ahead, but you're through the worst of the surgery." Clara was there too, her eyes red-rimmed, but shining with a fragile hope Emily hadn't seen in months. Leo arrived a few hours later, a small, vibrant sketch of a soaring bird clutched in his hand. He didn't say much, just sat by her bed, holding her hand, his silent presence a comfort. Recovery was excruciatingly slow at first. Every movement was a struggle, every breath a shallow effort. But Emily found herself clinging to the subtle shift in her body, the faint stirrings of hunger, the lessening of the pervasive fatigue, and with each passing day, she found herself reaching for her sketchbook. The nurses, initially curious, then accustomed, would retrieve it for her. She started with simple shapes, then moved to the faces of the nurses, the patterns on the hospital curtains, the play of light through the window. One afternoon, a young girl, no older than 7, with wispy hair and eyes too big for her face, was wheeled past her room. The girl saw Emily drawing and paused, her gaze fixed on the charcoal strokes. "What are you doing?" the girl whispered, her voice weak. "I'm drawing," Emily replied, a faint smile touching her lips. "Would you like to try?" The girl's eyes widened. A few days later, Emily, still weak but determined, was wheeled to the hospital's pediatric ward. The art therapist, a kind elderly woman named Martha, welcomed her with open arms. Emily started with easy guided exercises, helping the children choose colors, encouraging them to make their own marks. She found herself explaining perspective to a teenager battling leukemia, showing a small boy with a broken leg how to draw a fantastical dragon, its wings soaring over imagined landscapes. As she taught, something remarkable happened within her. The pain, though still present, receded into the background. The weariness that had been her constant companion began to lift. She wasn't just teaching art, she was sharing a piece of her resurrected self. Each stroke of a child's crayon, each delighted giggle, each hesitant question fueled a deeper, more profound healing than any medication could provide. Her own physical recovery, to the quiet astonishment of Dr. Sharma and the medical staff, began to accelerate. The persistent anemia, which had defied previous treatments, slowly began to improve. Her appetite returned with a vengeance. She started taking short walks in the hospital corridors, then longer ones. The feeling of purpose, of contributing, was a powerful tonic. It wasn't just her body healing, it was her spirit, finally unfettered, finally finding its true purpose in the selfless act of giving. The surgery that had truly saved her wasn't just the physical one, it was the opening of her heart. The surgery, a blur of sterile lights and hushed voices, was a gamble. Dr. Sharma had been brutally honest about the risks, Emily's weakened state making every incision, every stitch, a perilous journey. Yet when she finally drifted out of the anesthetic haze, an unexpected lightness permeated her being. The crushing pain was gone, replaced by a dull ache that was manageable, a promise of relief. It was a miracle, they said, that she had survived the extensive procedure, let alone emerged with such a relatively quick turnaround from the critical phase. The recovery was arduous, a slow crawl back from the brink. Days bled into weeks in the hospital, marked by the steady beeping of monitors, the quiet ministrations of nurses, and the ever-present smell of antiseptic. But Emily found a strange solace in the routine, the forced stillness. Her hands, once accustomed to drafting precise lines and handling complex models, now held a sketchbook and charcoal. She drew endlessly, from the intricate patterns of the IV drip to the subtle shifts of light on the hospital wall. Everything became a subject. One afternoon, a young art therapist, a kind-eyed woman named Sarah, noticed Emily's sketches. "These are beautiful, Emily," she said, her voice soft. "Have you ever thought about joining our art therapy sessions? We have a group for long-term patients." Emily, still frail, initially demurred. Her world had long revolved around her own creations, not participating in communal activities. But Sarah persisted, gently suggesting that Emily might even have something to teach. It was the word teach that caught her attention, a flicker of her old drive, repurposed. Hesitantly, she joined the group. It was a motley crew, a grizzled old man recovering from a stroke, a quiet teenager battling a chronic illness, and a handful of children, their small bodies often ravaged by the very conditions that kept them confined. Emily, the meticulous architect, found herself teaching a 7-year-old girl named Lily how to hold a crayon, showing a shy boy named Ben how to mix colors for a vibrant sunset. The children, in their uninhibited joy of creation, became her greatest teachers. They drew not for perfection, but for the sheer delight of it, their imaginations unfettered by structure or expectation. Emily watched them, her heart aching with a tenderness she hadn't known she possessed. Their resilience, Their small, brave smiles, despite their suffering, ignited something profound within her. She found herself sharing not just techniques, but stories. Stories of buildings that touched the sky, of bridges that spanned great rivers, but also, for the first time, stories of her own vulnerabilities, her fears, and her unexpected joy in this new, simpler form of creation. The children listened, their eyes wide, their questions direct and innocent. "Did you draw when you were sick, Emily?" Lily asked one day, her small hand expertly smudging charcoal on paper. Emily smiled, a genuine, unforced smile that reached her eyes. "Yes, Lily. It helped me remember what was good in the world, even when I felt bad." Each stroke of her own charcoal, each shared laugh, each moment of connection was a tiny thread in the tapestry of her healing. The hospital, once a symbol of her forced surrender, became a sanctuary, a place where she was rebuilding not just her body, but her very soul. Her physical recovery, initially slow, seemed to accelerate, defying medical expectations. Dr. Sharma, observing Emily's renewed vitality, shook her head in wonder. "You're truly remarkable, Emily. There's a light in you now that wasn't there before." Clara visited daily, her face softer now, etched with relief and a burgeoning respect. She saw the profound change in her mother, the shedding of the rigid shell that had encased her for so long. Leo, too, was a constant presence, his visits less about art, more about simply being together, sharing quiet moments, a comfortable silence hanging between them. He'd bring her new sketchbooks, different types of pencils, his eyes alight with pride as he watched her teach. The act of selfless giving, of pouring her creative energy into others, was a potent medicine. It was a healing that transcended the physical, reaching into the deepest parts of her spirit. The pain, once a constant companion, now receded into a manageable hum, a distant echo of a battle won. Emily, the pragmatic architect who had once dismissed anything that couldn't be measured or built, was finding her true strength in the immeasurable, in the beautiful, messy art of human connection. She was not just recovering, she was transforming. And in this transformation, she found a purpose far grander than any skyscraper she had ever designed.